Yeah, certainly. I think the other thing we need to remember is that these things are dynamic as well. You are expecting through the training process to improve them and for them to shift. Now, in an elite athlete, they won't shift very much necessarily, but we also have to be mindful of the fact that they also change day to day. And we have this notion
Yeah.
now of durability, where if you do a lot of moderate or heavy work, you accumulate a large volume of work, these things will actually drop over time. So, there's been some really nice work, sort of in relation to breaking two, showing that a 2 hour bout of exercise will drop your critical power by perhaps as much as 10%, at least in sub-elite individuals. But if you can imagine, if you're doing all of your training sessions in a zone and you're pushing the envelope, so you're pushing up to the maximal steady state all the time, eventually that's going to come down and you're going to flip into the wrong zone, if you like. You're going to end up doing a severe session when you should have been doing a heavy one. And so these sorts of minor changes to your physiology, both day to day and as a result of the work you're doing, can potentially have a profound impact on the stress you experience, and then obviously how that accumulates over time as well. So you've got to, like you say, you've got to be monitoring this stuff to make sure that you are where you want to be, because it's quite easy to end up in a place where you don't want to be if you're trying to push it all the time.
And you alluded to the fact that the up to moderate, that's a fairly large zone. You know, anything from rest all the way up to first lactate turn point, and then heavy is varied, quite varied in terms of its scope for athletes and so on. And severe is just everything north, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
But with a I suppose a definition that in the middle of that extreme that might not be as tangible for everybody. And so what's your recommendation for people when they prescribe an exercise intensity or the thinking about their physiological responses, about how they use the different sized zones to make sense of their world? Because I think that just categorizing everything below lactate threshold as one training zone, I'm not sure that's going to be that helpful for people. Equally, between severe and maximal exercise, that's got quite a lot of slices for a lot of people.
It's a tricky one, because the other thing we don't know with any great degree of certainty is what doing certain things in certain parts of those zones will actually achieve. So there's been some research over the last 10 years or so that suggested that angiogenesis, so capillarization, so building your blood vessels, this is the sort of thing that you'd need to do lots of low intensity work for. So you need to be exercising in the moderate domain. Funnily enough, when you actually look at the intensities they were working at, it was 60 to 70% VO2 max. It wasn't based on lactate threshold at all. So actually they were probably in the heavy domain. And it was also suggested that doing high intensity intervals was not the best thing to do for angiogenesis. But then when you read the small print of that work, that study was actually the second part of the first study that talked about doing moderate exercise. So the participants who were doing the high intensity work had just done 8 weeks of training. So they weren't actually untrained to start with. So trying to understand what the underlying physiology and how these adaptations are going to occur in each domain is really something we don't have any good handle on at the moment, partly because from a molecular perspective, we've pretty much identified a couple of pathways that work in terms of mitochondrial biogenesis. And we don't know how big the amplification of those pathways is if you do lots of moderate work versus doing more heavy work versus doing severe and extreme work. Most training studies are in the heavy and severe domain by definition, because researchers have got a finite amount of time. They want to make sure it works. So they stick with the high intensity, often sprint interval training or high intensity interval training, to get as much bang for their buck as they possibly can. that's not helpful if you're then trying to develop a training program that has some kind of physiological justification to it. So this is a very long-winded way of saying I can't really answer your question.
No, it's an
from an
interesting
evidence
one.
base, because we don't have it yet. Is the simple answer.